Alright, so Pinegrove, indie rock kit from Montclair, New Jersey, a lot of times ends up going under the moniker of just indie music. Now that's not inaccurate, but if you listen to more than a few songs, you'll kind of quickly realize that that isn't the entire story. I think Pinegrove's probably better described as a genre blend of three key genres. We got not only indie, but also Americana and country stuff, and also some Midwestern emo in there too. Now over the course of their 10-year discography, they've kind of started in an indie place and ended up in a way more country Americana infused sound. The point of this whole video slash dissertation is to kind of take you through the Pinegrove discography and kind of show you how they started in indie and ended up in country, and use a little music theory along the way to kind of explain all the things that are happening in between. So let's just get right into it. So the band's first LP, Everything So Far, came out in 2015. It's just kind of like a massive dump of songs that it's not really like a cohesive album, it's just like a collection. And a lot of these songs are rooted in mostly indie stuff. The only country-esque thing you'll hear is the banjo occasionally and instrumentation. Other than that, it's classic indie stuff. It's just guitar, drums, vocals, lead guitar, and occasionally synth. Now in terms of harmonic progressions on this record, there's kind of two situations you can find yourself in. Either A, the song's in major, like Need To, and in that case, you'll just hear a simple 1 to 4 a lot of the time. But if the song is in minor, you'll probably hear a 1 to 7 to 3 to 1 type of progression, like in Size of the Moon. A few key things to keep in mind moving forward is that a lot of these songs, all of these songs actually, are very clearly written for guitar. If you try and take any of the chords and try and just play them on guitar, you realize that you really don't need to move that many fingers to get from one chord to the next. We'll touch on this more later, but this kind of plays into this whole concept of cowboy chord voicing, which is basically just a term for saying playing chords very openly, the most open way possible, least amount of fingers to get that really ringing, like country-esque full acoustic guitar tone. But with this in mind, you might be like, how are these songs lasting 3-4 minutes just based on the same few chords? And well, that's just because everything else is doing the heavy lifting, right? Dynamics, instrumentation, vocal phrasing, drum patterns. These are the things that are different from Pinegrove track to Pinegrove track, not necessarily the harmonic approach. With Need To, it's the addition of the banjo at the minute 10 mark, the addition of background vocals at the minute 30 mark, and the addition of a synth solo at the minute 52 mark instead of something like a guitar solo. All these things are keeping you on edge and listening. With Size of the Moon, it's the drum pattern switches and the overall build of the song over time. In fact, at a show I was at, before Evan played it, he said, like a lot of Pinegrove songs, this one starts very softly and gets very loud. So be ready for that. And that's a strategy they use a lot, and that could be attributed to a little more of the emo element that I mentioned earlier as opposed to indie stuff. And like I said, Size of the Moon does this to the T, especially on the Audio Tree Live version. Alright, now on to Cardinal. This is the one that got Pinegrove a lot of attention. Their actual, packaged first LP that was like very marketable. And a handful of songs were carried over from Everything So Far onto Cardinal, but I managed to pick a few that were exclusive to Cardinal to kind of show the progression of how Pinegrove are writing songs over time. Now, Aphasia, a fan favorite of the band's, actually utilizes a bit of a different harmonic approach. This is a bit of an oddball, but it uses the jazz turnaround progression, right? It goes for that 2-5-1, and it really has this like loopable quality to it, like a lot of 2-5-1 jazz songs do, and this kind of helps it last for the amount of time that it does. This track specifically features 4 different strumming patterns and a very well articulated use of dynamics, right? At the beginning, you have soft finger picking, you have vocals, you have soft drums, and then by the end, you have this super tight guitar solo. And also keep in mind, while not on the studio recording, a pedal steel is often added to the mix live to kind of enhance the feel of the track and switch up the instrumentation. Aphasia is also just a classic example of a love-lost song. A lot of Pinegrove lyrics are super emotional, and that's a lot of the time the reason people throw in that Midwestern emo moniker in there as well.
So long, aphasia, and the ways it kept me hidden. So long, the silent nerves and hesitant oblivion.
Okay, on to Waveform. Waveform is a lesser known track on this record, but I would argue it's a pretty good example of how Pinegrove's starting to ease into that country-esque sound a little more, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. So basically, the verses of the song utilize a pretty easy 1-4, pretty classic indie stuff, you see it everywhere. But in the chorus of this track, it does what a lot of Pinegrove songs from here on out tend to do pretty often, which is walk up to a predominant or dominant place in the harmonic progression, and then walk back to 1 the same way they came. The chorus of Waveform walks up from 1 to 5 to 7 and then back through a predominant 4 back to the tonic at 1. These types of progressions are often the more country sounding ones, and we'll see why a little bit later. Moving on to the band's third LP, Skylight, a little more country instrumentation is added, but essentially the same songwriting tactics are at play. The opener wastes no time getting the listener acquainted with an instrument they're going to hear pretty often throughout the entire record, the pedal steel. By the first chorus on Rings, you already definitely know it's there. And as mentioned earlier, it's a Pinegrove song in a minor key, so it's going to utilize 1, 7, and 3. Again, the chords here, classic cowboy stuff, centered in open voicing and just straight up convenience to play as a songwriter. And aside from the pedal steel and the chord voicings here, there's not a lot else that's country that's going on with this song. In fact, I'd even argue that it leans more indie and emo because that drum pattern is definitely indie. And I would say the vocal expression and dynamic range by the time Evan gets to the chorus and screaming is definitely rooted in some emo.
Forgetting the words I'm singing for you. Am I forgetting I failed? You're sleeping with your rings on.
Now, the other track that I think is worth taking a look at off of Skylight is Darkness, and it's for a reason I stated earlier. It's actually for the harmonic progression. Darkness's harmonic progression does exactly what a lot of Pinegrove songs do. They walk up to a predominant or dominant place and walk back the way they came. Now, if you don't believe me and you think that's a fluke, well, Easy Enough on this record does it too.
And it's never satisfied. Saying it's never what I thought. I'm happy then I'm not. No, I got darkness on my mind.
Okay, now onto the band's most country sounding release to date, Marigold. Now, unfortunately, Marigold doesn't really feature the banjo as prominently at all throughout the entire record, but you do get more pedal steel for sure, and you get more country-esque harmonic progressions the entire way through. Take Neighbor, for example. This is the most country track Pinegrove has ever produced to date. Ever. The verses are helped along by a simple 1-5, and as you'd expect, cowboy chords, open voicings, very convenient, very easy to switch between, and on the chorus you have a very bluegrassy 1-4-5-1. Now if you notice, we have a second E in that chorus, and you might think that's where the loop ends, and that's how the chorus goes. But actually we have a C sharp minor 7 chord after that kind of acts like a 6 to kind of keep us in a 1 area, and then we walk back through the predominant and dominant areas of the progression to get back to 1. Sound like a familiar technique?
Determined behavior. If it were me, I probably might have just stayed there.
And last but certainly not least, we have the track Hairpin. Now Hairpin is based in a very simple 1-5 most of the time. And it's got this 3-4-6-8 thing going on where it kind of just rocks slowly back and forth between 1 and 5. And that kind of gives it the country feel. It's just 2 cowboy chords slowly rocking back and forth. And you also have a bit of an emo element here at play because by the end of the song, the entire band is in and rocking significantly louder than they were at the beginning. Okay, so 8 tracks in, and what did we learn? Well, Pinegrove is certainly very far from jazz, okay? But that's not the point. The point here is that Pinegrove makes use of literally everything else besides harmonic complexity, right? Really solid instrumentation, dynamics, vocal phrasing, drum patterns, strumming patterns. Everything else is changing around the simplest element, the harmonic progression. One could go as far as to say Pinegrove could be classified as singer-songwriter type stuff. And you wouldn't really be wrong, but it's the fact that this singer-songwriter quality lives and breathes through all these other changes that are going on within the song that are supplied by the band, right? Pinegrove works because the band acts as the limbs to the songwriter and kind of gives it extra expression when it needs it and less expression when it needs it. It's just like a breathing extension of the songwriter. And that's why it works. It is very much the case that Evan on his own would not be as successful with his band members and vice versa. They very much rely on each other to create the special thing they have going. For me, they're just well-written songs in a genre fusion that I enjoy. I think that's how a lot of other people see it too. And hopefully now you can have a better understanding as to why it's enjoyed. Thanks for watching.
Through this circumstance, but it's tiring. Through Zinfandel eyes, through